Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
What you know, good Ann Camp? You're listening to the Ann Campaign's Church Politics Podcast with Justin Giboney, a.k.a. Bishop Cooper's grandson, and the Windy City representative, the baddest brother above the Mason-Dixon line, my play cousin, the Right Reverend Christopher Butler. Thankfully today, me and Chris are not alone, though. We have invited a friend who we talked to back in 2020, so she's been on here before. I'm surprised that it's been that long, but I want to introduce someone who's an attorney, a former politico, a theologian, and someone whose opinions I just really respect, and that is the Kathryn Freeman. Kathryn, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so glad to be back.
Yeah, glad to have you. I'm mad at myself that it's taken so long. I know you've been busy, so you ain't just been waiting on our call, but I'm mad at myself that we hadn't got you back on earlier. If somebody would ask me, I thought it would be like 2 years that it's been, but it's been 4 years. 2020 is the last time we talked. We talked about Kamala Harris, all those things, some of the things that we're going to get into today. So again, thank you for being with us. All right.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think it's because I have seen you since then. We've seen each other quite a bit. It's just I haven't been on the podcast.
Yeah, yeah. That's right. Saw each other at Baylor. I guess, was that earlier this year or in the last year?
Earlier this year? I think it was the spring, right?
I think so.
A lot going on in time.
A lot going on. Chris, how have you been?
I've been well. Life is a party in the Butler household. So
life is a party. That's what I want to hear. All right, that's what I want to hear. Let me first say this before we really get into all this conversation, because we're going to talk a lot about Biden. We're going to talk a lot about the now Harris campaign. I want y'all to know that I've heard you. All right, people have been asking me for the last month or so to talk about Project 2025. And I definitely hear you. I've been reading through it. I've been studying it. It's obviously no short piece of work. But what I've been trying to do behind the scenes is get someone from one of the several conservative organizations that supported or sponsored or whatever you want to say, Project 2025, to come on and have a conversation with us about what it really means. Because I want to be charitable and I don't want this show to just be a meme. There's a whole lot of stuff in there that I disagree with, but I want to make sure that we're getting the best argument for it. I don't know that I could provide the best argument for it. So that's what I've been trying to do behind the scenes. I haven't been ignoring you, even though some of y'all are supposed to be, in order to ask for us to talk about stuff, y'all supposed to be premium members. Y'all asking anyway through other channels. I still heard you, right? I still heard you. So I'm hoping that's forthcoming. I haven't been successful in getting somebody to come on just yet, but I'm working on it and hoping that comes up because it is a big issue. And while a lot of the stuff I disagree with, I don't know that all the memes are accurate, right? There's a lot of groups on there that I disagree with, but there's certain groups that I have disagreements with, but I think they're somewhat reasonable. So I want them to kind of come in and talk about what it really means to them. Because some of the stuff is just basic conservative stuff that folks have been talking about forever. Other stuff is a little further out there, but I'm not the best person to probably talk about that. So that's where I'm coming from on that. Any quick thoughts from you two on Project 2025?
I mean, so here's what I would say to listeners. I think a charitable view of this would involve acknowledging that the presidency over the course of United States history has expanded its power. So has the administrative state. So if you go all the way back to like an Andrew Jackson style spoil system where the president comes in, cleans house, and puts all of his political appointees in, as the state grows, as the country grows, like geographically and the number of people, all those types of things, there does come this idea that you need more sort of professionalism and institutional memory in the administrative state. And so you kind of get rid of the spoil system and you get more of an idea of civil service. then over time, I do think there is a need to look at what we have now, which is a very large administrative state where a lot of people who are unelected have a lot of power.
Too much
And
power. Yeah.
there is something to say about an election taking place and people saying, we want this individual to be the president of the United States. And that person not being able to actually carry out whatever is their electoral mandate because they don't have their hands around the administrative state quite enough. Project 2025, I think, moves way too far in the wrong direction. Well, maybe in the right direction, but much too far. One of the things that I picked up recently and sort of read through that I would recommend to folks, there's a book from a guy named Graham Dodds called The Unitary Presidency. And it really explores this idea of presidential power and how it has expanded and what it really is supposed to look like. It helps to frame one's thinking about Project 2025, because I think Project 2025 is basically an approach to really leaning into the idea of a unitary executive and that the president, that individual, should be able to execute whatever they want to do through the state.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because what they were planning to do with just the full administration and the agencies, some people were saying that that was like completely unconstitutional. I'm like, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I wouldn't be mad at Biden if he came in and cleaned up, the agencies and stuff like that. Trump has a way. Trump can do that too. How far is he going to go with that? Those are the things that I want us to be clear on. And we talked about the presidency's power growing, but a lot of the reason we've come to the conclusion that it grows because the legislative branch isn't doing what they're trying to do. They're punting everything so that they can just stay in office and not have to deal with, some of the tougher questions that they really should be leading on, not following the president on. Any thoughts, Kathryn?
Yeah, I was just going to say also too, I mean, I agree. I also think that I think part of it is, as the country has grown and, things are just like more complex than they were, I think back then. I think also too, there is some value for some institutional knowledge, right? So like, then I think to what Chris is saying about, does this go too far? Like, I definitely think there's a space for like consideration of presidential powers. And I also would say, I think for me, like, taking a step back from like the actual content, and I know this is just like a consistent and campaign message, I also think it matters how you engage with this, or people that maybe this is their like worldview. And so coming from a place of curiosity, like doing your research and not jumping to, like, I would say fear mongering and memes, I think especially for Christians, the sort of part of being a Christian in democracy is, I would love to see us lead more in the like discourse rather than the sort of like being kind of the slow to speak and bringing that to like everything, right? Not just in our sort of personal interactions, but even how we interact with, like, when we get those like alarming text messages from like family members that are like, have you heard of Project 25? Yeah. It's like, how do we even 2025? It's like, how do we even respond in those kind of small moments? Are we modeling the kinds of sort of the Christian distinctives, even when it comes to those kinds of things? So I would say, I definitely think like doing your research and giving fair consideration, even if you disagree. Like, I'm not saying, because I certainly don't agree, but I think one of the things I'm increasingly concerned about is like our approach to these conversations.
Yeah. Nah, that's you and me both. I mean, some of the memes that I've seen, some of the no real argument put out there, just Project 2025. And that's like your whole reason for everything. It's like, we need to be a little more thoughtful than memes and just like a tagline. So we're on the same page with that. As usual, guys, I want to give a shout out to all our patrons and supporters for supporting us in what we do and how we do it. I cannot emphasize enough how grateful I am for the people that have invested in the AND campaign, that have said, this is something I believe in. This is a message I want to hear. Let me give to it so it can go a little further. Part of the reason that you don't hear what, me and Chris, although we would like to think we're special and unique, we're only so special and unique. Part of the reason that you don't hear commentary like this is because there's no funding for it, right? Part of the reason that you don't have more AND campaigns saying what we do, offending the left and the right by chance, not on purpose, not just for the purpose of offending people, is because you can get blacklisted, and there's not a lot of people that are going to give to that type of effort that doesn't fit on one side or the other. So thank you to everybody who is actually giving, investing in what the AND campaign is doing, investing in Church Politics Podcast. And if you're not, please consider it. Right? There's a reason that you don't hear more of this type of commentary. All right. If you are watching on YouTube, please make sure you like and subscribe so we can deal with that algorithm a little bit better. All right. But it's time to get into it. All right. So grab your Bible, get your mind right, and prepare to think not like a Republican, not like a Democrat, but to think like a Christian. And as usual, guys, I know I didn't do it last week, but as usual, I want to start with scripture. And so I want to start with James chapter 3, verses 17 through 18. James chapter 3, verses 17 through 18, and it reads, "But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." I really want Christians to focus in on that scripture during this election season. We're talking about wisdom. Wisdom is not being caught, you can't have wisdom and be caught up in the moment, right? You have to be thinking, understand the moment, but you also have to be thinking beyond the moment, all right? And applying that kind of biblical wisdom. Pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive. And the other one I want to point out is impartial. We talk about impartiality a lot, and some people mistake impartiality for neutrality. So I don't think that Christians have to go into this election as neutral and say, everything's the same. It doesn't really matter. No. We need to be impartial. Impartial doesn't mean that you don't think one candidate is better or one party is better necessarily, but it does mean that you apply the same standard and you apply it fairly. All right. So let's make sure that we're applying the same standard so that we can reap a harvest of righteousness and that we're being peacemakers. Watch what you post, watch what you reshare, watch what you say, because this is about to be a very interesting and a good and probably mostly a bad way when it comes to this election season. All right, let's get into it. So the big news, which it seems like for this last 2 weeks, there's been big news like every other day, from assassination attempts to now we have Biden actually ends up dropping out. Now, from the reports that I'm hearing, this is not something that he wanted to do. Like, this was done against his will. So it's interesting. All the people like, man, this was so selfless. And he didn't want to drop out. He was like, hey, I got the votes. I won the primary. I don't want to drop out. From what I'm hearing, it was like pulling teeth, and almost he had to be threatened for this to happen. And this is my opinion. This isn't speaking for anybody else on this podcast. The issue that I have with the way things went down, and you may think it's necessary, but the issue that I have mostly is Democratic leadership knew what type of condition Biden was in for, if you ask me, over a year. They've known what his issues are. Those issues only became a big deal when the voters found out through that debate how bad it really was. And so when conservatives say this was somewhat of a cover-up, and this, one could almost say, could compromise democracy because you knew somebody who had these struggles was in office, I can't disagree with that. They knew what he was going through. They knew his condition, whether it's Pelosi, Obama, whatever. They were with this guy. They talked to this guy. They knew what was going on, but it didn't become a big deal until the people saw it. That's a problem. Then when it became a big deal, I don't know how else to explain this, but he got stabbed in the back. I mean, I would say that the way they did him was wrong, knowing what the condition was. This is politics. One of my mentors told me early on, Chris and Kathryn, politics is a blood sport. And this is politics. This is the blood sport of politics. So any of you Christians that are getting into politics, I'm not telling you to stay out of it, but just know that friends aren't always friends for long. Now, the AND campaign, we believe that allies, these are people we care about and trust. We're not just in this just kind of get our way and then throw people away. But in politics, you can't get thrown away. And that's exactly what happened to Biden. I know you want to talk, Chris, but I'm going to make you have manners today. And we're going to have Kathryn go first. Go ahead, Kathryn.
Yeah, no, I actually totally agree with you. And I feel like it's not even just Democratic leadership. I mean, Democratic donors,
Yes.
like people had been in rooms with him for over a year. Personally, when he announced that he was going to seek re-election, I think polls consistently said like the number one concern with Biden was his age. So to me, the fact that, no one really challenged him in the primary. And so all these primary voters were just like trusting what they had been told, and seen from leaders. And, Pelosi was like defending him until she wasn't. And so I think two things. I think one, the democracy aspect of like the fact that like for Democratic primary voters, like Harris was on the ticket. So I do think in terms of what is the least damaging thing you could do would probably be her. But because she was on the ticket, so people did cast their vote for a Biden-Harris ticket. But I am concerned too, and I think I said this online, people being prone to conspiracies already. Like I have some family members that like weeks before Biden dropped out were like, he's on his deathbed, all of these like kind of things. And I remember like in the family group chat, and I was like, no, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. And then, of course, they turned out to be correct. And so even that in a season of misinformation, the ways in which this, on both sides, one, I think is harmful to democracy, but I think also, two, for dealing with that sort of conspiratorial element of like, can we trust, quote unquote, I don't like this term because technically I fall, as someone who's like super educated, I fall into the elite category, but quote unquote elites, as it's used as like a boogeyman or pejorative term, do seem to have more control than the regular sort of everyday people. And to the extent that they're behind closed doors and we don't know what's going on, I can see where that creates a space, an increased space for conspiratorial thinking. So I agree. I share your concerns. And I don't think that this, I do think he was stabbed in the back. I do think they should have intervened sooner. And I think it is, as much as it's being painted as a selfless act, I mean, I'm glad that he finally listened, or however this came about. But I also think like, man, why couldn't we have had this conversation like a year ago?
Right, exactly. That would have been the responsible thing to do. But, well, Chris, I hope I haven't offended your sensibilities. When I said the Democrats knew beforehand, it looked like you grimaced. Have I gone too far, Chris? Help me out here. I hope I haven't offended you.
Well, I want to say, for the sake of my children and my grandmother who listen to the podcast, that Justin doesn't have to make me have manners. But the part of the power behind this, and I don't know about, I've heard some things about Baltimore politics, but two of the key people behind this whole thing were former President Barack Obama and former Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Folks have to remember that Barack Obama won his first election by getting his boss in the state Senate kicked off the ballot. He challenged his boss's petitions and got her kicked off the ballot. So as much as his presidential campaign was hope and change, Barack Obama comes from the bare knuckle politics of Chicago Democratic politics. And so it's not surprising to me to see folks like that, because again, I've heard similar stories about Baltimore. That's not where I'm from, but when it comes to winning elections and doing power, friendships only go so far in most cases. I think that for sure this is something that folks make the calculation that they could get Biden across. At least that's what I think. I think that's what the calculation was, but you never know. But this is certainly something that does not look good in terms of, I don't know, like modeling a peaceable sort of disposition. That's usually not what prevails in our politics. And so I think we just saw at the national level a little bit of Chicago style Democratic politics play out.
Yeah, it seems like it got pretty nasty, and we know that Pelosi as well as Obama, they know how to wield power. That's not something that they struggle with, and it looks like they did that in a real way. All right, here's what I want to do now. I want to talk a little bit about the Biden administration before we get into Kamala and what her candidacy means. I want to talk about the Biden administration, and so first, I want us to all go through and name some of the accomplishments, like what was good about the Biden administration, and then we'll talk about some of the Biden administration's failures. I would start this conversation with the CHIPS Act. I think the CHIPS Act was a huge win for the Biden administration. Of course, with that, they were trying to bring manufacturing back to America. The thing about the CHIPS Act is it's not something that's going to have an immediate impact. So although it passes, it's big, it's going to take years to push forward. And so people aren't going to feel it immediately. And so he might not get the credit for it that I think he should get for it. I don't think enough people talk about that. The other thing I'll talk about is the withdrawal from Afghanistan. He got a lot of pushback for that withdrawal from your kind of neocons and your neoliberals. And he stood by it. It could have been cleaner, right? It didn't look great the way that it went down towards the end, but it was something that needed to be done. And then lastly, I think Chris might talk about this, so I'm not going to go deep into it. The best thing that the Biden administration did was put Lena Khan in her position. And I'll kind of leave it at that. Kathryn, what are you thinking?
Yeah, so I think for me, I'm probably going to pick two-ish things that are kind of connected to where I am just now. So one, I live in Texas, and climate change is crazy. I mean, it is raining ridiculously in July. We had the hottest June we've ever had on record, and I think people have their feelings about whether it's man-made or not, but I think just the reality of being, and I know I'm not alone in this, being in a place where we are having extreme weather, where I actually just was talking to a friend that their church lost their insurance because the company, Church Mutual, which provides insurance for churches here in Texas, has moved out of Texas because it's become too expensive to provide insurance to property here because of the extreme weather. And so I think one thing I want to give credit to the Biden administration for is pushing renewable energy. We're now like the number 2 producer of renewable energy. It's the second most type of energy we're producing. So they've really increased renewable energy. And then I think a related thing that was kind of hidden within the sort of bipartisan infrastructure act was the increase in funding for the charging stations for electric vehicles. I know, like, I have a bunch of people in my family that either have hybrids or electric vehicles, and that has been a big thing of, like, it's difficult to, like, take those kinds of cars on long trips because there's not many, you have to think about where the charging stations are. So I think that was, like, one small thing, and that they really seem to be pushing sort of these kinds of, like, responsible kind of creation care stewardship kinds of things, I think did really well. And then the other thing is refugee resettlement. Under the previous administration, the refugee resettlement program had been decimated. It was like down to like 15,000 as the cap, but they never reached that in the last year. And under this Biden administration, we're back up to 125,000, I think, as the cap. And we're well on our way to actually meeting that. And then I guess then the last thing I'll talk about, well, maybe I'll talk about this when we talk about Harris, but then the last thing I will mention is the creation of the first Office of Gun Violence Prevention that's within the executive branch. I think as someone, as gun violence and gun crime has just been increasingly rampant. I mean, we saw an assassination attempt, school shootings, there, kind of interpersonal violence, the sort of easy access to guns. I think taking that seriously partly because Congress has been unable to act, but creating sort of a centralized place for research and best practices in terms of reducing gun violence, I think is also something I would like to give them credit for.
Good stuff. Chris, what you got?
Yeah, so I think I'll put this first piece, which will probably reemerge as we talk about failures, but the passage of the American Rescue Plan, I think, was a big sort of legislative accomplishment on the part of the Biden administration. I don't think people who listen to the podcast will be surprised to hear me again sing the praises of the expanded child tax credit. That was part of that, and I think that was good policy, and they got it through the legislature. the infrastructure. Kathryn talked about the charging stations for electric vehicles, but the broader investment in American infrastructure, I think, is huge. It's another one of those things, like you talked about, Justin, that is not going to show up inside of Biden's presidency, and some other president in the future will probably be taking credit for it, and governors and legislators all over the place. But that was a Biden administration thing. Obviously, getting Lena Khan in the job and the work that she's done on antitrust, I think is probably the brightest spot for me in the Biden administration. I think when we consider what's happening in this election cycle, for me, that's one of the biggest things that is at risk, and it's one of the things that I would like to hear both candidates talk about, where they want to go on issues of antitrust and sort of reining in capitalism, not rejecting it, but certainly reining it in. And we've said this a number of times on the podcast. If you believe in capitalism, you've got to be open to putting some boundaries around it so that it doesn't destroy itself and the rest of the country with it. And then along with that, I think Biden's labor policy, specifically his National Labor Relations Board, and the ability to really be a good NLRB, in my opinion. It hasn't been the kind of NLRB that just lets every labor union do whatever it wants to do because it is a labor union, but they really have empowered workers to actually come together and form collective bargaining units inside of their workplaces so that workers have greater voice in their specific workplaces. And I think that not only contributes to unionized workplaces, but union activity, in my opinion, sort of lifts all workers, whether they work at a union shop or not. So those are my sort of hits that play from the Biden administration.
And one of the points that you make about the NRLB is one that I would make about Lena Khan too. While she has been doing some serious work when it comes to antitrust, preventing monopolies, and what we're talking about here, guys, is not letting business exploit consumers. She has really protected consumers from all these mergers that really allow some of these people to take over a whole industry, raise prices without bringing any innovation into the conversation. She has really hit hard on that, but she hasn't done it just as kind of like a raging, just activist trying to punish corporations. I don't think she's done that at all, but I think she's followed the law and said this doesn't fit the spirit of what we should be trying to do if we really care about our economy and if we really care about consumers. So I think those are all good. And then quickly, let's try to go through some of the failures of the Biden administration. And Chris, I'll start with you on this one. And for the record, since his mother and his children do listen, Chris has great manners, better than mine, but I'm still going to mess with him. Go ahead.
So I would have to start with allowing the American Rescue Plan to essentially be completely rolled back. I think that, one of the sort of truisms in politics is never let a good crisis go to waste. And there were things in the American Rescue Plan, like expanding the child tax credit, like thinking differently about what we do around unemployment, that were able to be passed into law because of the COVID crisis. And much of the first half of the Biden administration was, after that was passed, just seeing plank after plank after plank of that legislation be rolled back. And I think that was a mistake, and is probably the biggest thing that I would say was a failure. I think that I probably venture on to very perilous ground when I say this, but I think that the management of the crisis in Israel and in Gaza has not done a lot to move our country into this into the unified place that we want to be internally, or even the place we want to be in terms of our world leadership. And I would leave that there as not to get too much attack. But those will probably be my big things, and that's setting aside the whole, scandal of mental decline for
Right.
several years and covering it up. But outside of that, those are my two big ones I point to.
All right. Thank you for that. Kathryn, what you got?
Yeah, I would second the child tax credit, the expiring of the child tax credit. I think that was a huge loss. As someone who cares a lot about the ways in which we support or don't support families and caregiving in this country, that was hugely disappointing to me. And I think the other thing I'll talk about is the border. I do think that has been a huge failure of this administration. I think both in terms of I think that there was a good segment of people, at least in my circle, that voted for Biden over President Trump because they thought he was going to do something different on the border. And he did not do that. I think it took him a long time to roll back some of those Trump policies, partly because of politics, not because it was about the policies themselves. I think it was political. I think the actions we've seen in the last month or so are also not that in terms of limiting asylum and access to asylum. Asylum is a legal way to migrate into this country. Closing off that opportunity when we don't have the infrastructure, like a big part of it is like the resources, like asylum judges and case officers and all of those kinds of things that go into it, to then effectively shut down and limit people that are fleeing really perilous situations that have already been like waiting a year, that can't work, or all of these things. To me, that has been very disappointing. And I think has been disappointing. I think I've been really disappointed in the border policies and the way in which it felt less like leadership and more like following whatever the crowd or whoever's voices were the loudest on the issue, rather than trying to have an honest conversation about how this country, we have not had any sort of major immigration reform since 1965, and the ways in which the system just isn't working for anybody. Both people who migrate legally and want to migrate legally, and in ways in which people are coming in undocumented. Like, why don't we have more, worker visas and those kinds of things? And so I think to me that's been a big disappointment of the Biden administration.
Okay. Good stuff. One of the first one I'm going to point out is the canceling student debt. One of the ways that they went about that, they actually had different avenues that they could have went. And it seems very clear to me as an attorney that they went with the avenue that wasn't going to pass the muster of the Supreme Court. So almost like they could say that they tried to do it and they could blame conservatives for stopping it when they had other and better avenues to travel. Now, student debt to me was a mixed bag. And I explained this on this before. I think most of the people who need money the most aren't going to be helped by student debt. Now, I would take it. Believe me, I would take it. And I think it would help a lot of people. But I also think something like canceling medical debt or something like that would actually go a lot further and help the people who need it the most, right? So I'm not saying that was my favorite policy, but the way they went about it, I think, was dishonest. And I think they could have done a better job with that. I also think the way that just the whole Ukraine, everything, a lot of the things that went down when it comes to Ukraine just wasn't cool. I think it was too much money. I think it's unclear if this is a war that Ukraine can even win, right? Like, then the corruption. I mean, Ukraine is a very corrupt country. We're sending money over there, can't explain where it went. And then you want people I don't understand how people can get mad if folks are saying, wait, you sent this much money and we can't really explain exactly what it went to and where these guns are. You know what I'm saying? Like, that whole thing was a mess. One of the biggest things, more general and more culture-based, in my opinion, though, is I believe that Biden was elected because he was kind of a normie Democrat. He was somebody they felt could bring stability, somebody who wouldn't act too crazy on social issues. However, when it came to social issues on a cultural level, I don't think Biden pushed back on the left at all. So whether it was transgenderism or whatever, I think he kind of let the left run wild, whether it be at the White House or whatever, and did not step in a way that I think people expected him to say, hey, let's neutralize this. That's not our focus. let's focus on the economy. Let's focus on other things. He failed to do that. And to me, that was one of the biggest letdowns because I didn't expect him to come in and not have any pushback against some of the stuff that's happening on the left. And people tend, and even when we're talking about new candidates, people tend to underestimate the impact that a president has on the culture and what happens from the White House and the impact that it has on the culture. That was a huge disappointment for me when it comes to what Biden was doing. Any other thoughts before we go to this next segment? All right. Well, we will be right back on the Church Politics Podcast to talk about the new Democratic nominee, which is Kamala Harris. See you in a second.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. So on Sunday, Biden drops out. He said, I'm not going to be part of the ticket. Initially, he didn't endorse Kamala, right? In that initial letter, and it was weird that it was a letter and not just this, he just didn't make a public statement and on video and stuff like that. That's all. I'm not getting into conspiracy theories. I'm just saying that was kind of weird. So initially he doesn't endorse her. Right after that, just probably 10-some minutes later, he actually says he's endorsing Kamala for that position. Okay. And I'll be honest with you, the immediate amount of energy that flowed into Democratic spaces, especially African-American spaces, was huge. Like when you talk about the African-American professional class, political class, the amount of energy that's in those spaces, I can't say I was expecting it to that extent, right? Because, Kamala is someone who, honestly, when she ran for president the first time in 2020, she didn't even make it back home, right? She was about to lose to, Andrew Yang? She was about to lose to Yang in her home state. And so she dropped out. But the energy that I see from the church community, a lot of different spaces, I wasn't necessarily expecting. It was crazy. Is that something you're seeing too, Kathryn?
Yeah, I think 100%. It's almost, I hesitate to make this comparison, but it feels very Obama 08 like. And I think part of it was, as someone who wasn't crazy about her in 2019, I think part of it is the sort of feeling that, the kind of rumblings of conversation that if Biden dropped out, we would need to get another sort of, that she would be jumped over or skipped. And I feel like for professional African Americans, that they took that very personally. So even to the extent that they're like, I don't know, can she, or have any sort of hesitation, I think that feeling, especially as a Black woman, I'll just be honest, that sort of, I think also too motivated a lot of my friends that have been critical of her to be like, wait, hold on. Like, she's not our favorite person, but we don't like the idea of skipping over her for like a normie sort of white male Democrat. Because, not that I don't think that there's any precedent, but something about that I think rubbed a lot of Black women the wrong way. And I think that is part of the energy.
Yeah, I think it is definitely part of the energy. Now, I'll be honest with you. I was hoping that he would endorse Lena Khan. I've said Lena Khan for president. That's what I was hoping would happen. Obviously, it didn't happen and wasn't likely to happen. But one thing I have to admit, because I haven't been a big fan of Kamala, right? I look at some of her policies. I look at some of the stuff she did in California. One of my issues with her was how she dealt with that. So before the economy fell apart in 2008, all the stuff that was going on in housing, a lot of that started in California. And if you haven't read Homewrecker, you need to read that book. A lot of that stuff going on with the banks and all that started in California. And if you look at Kamala's record, while she was a prosecutor, she refused to prosecute some of the people, Munchin, folks like that that were part of this taking advantage of people, taking their houses and all that. Once I really looked into that and saw that, I've never really been a huge Kamala fan. I'll be honest with you. I just don't like identity politics. I love Black representation. I want Black people who are qualified to be in positions, because I know the history of this country shows us that representation matters. And if you're not at the table, then your interest is not going to be represented. To me, that doesn't justify me just voting for somebody just because they're Black, but it's something that, keep in mind. So as we talk about some stuff like that, I still don't see, Chris, a whole lot of policy substance behind why people are supporting her. It's mostly anybody but Trump, or it's, she's Black and, we got to ride with our people. Talk to me a little bit about that, if you're seeing that, and then you can go into whatever you've been seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely seeing that. And I think there are two dynamics at play, right? In the broader sort of like just Democratic Party circle, it's just this idea that there's somebody else, right? I think for a moment after the debate, it was like, this is just going to be a long slog, because you're going to have a candidate who who doesn't even have a shot to try to make it a race. And so because Biden lowered the bar so much, when your average sort of like Democratic Party activist sees like, yo, we got a candidate who can complete a sentence. You don't have to worry when she starts a sentence if she's going to know where she is by the time she gets to the end of that sentence. And it's like, this is great for them. And then in the Black community, I think Kathryn sort of put it really, really well. I think that when the ball is on the 1 yard line, as it is right now, because it's different when you got Kamala Harris running in the Democratic primary to try to get the nomination. When the ball's on the 1 yard line, for Black folks, it's not about the person, it's about the principle. Don't skip this Black woman. And then once we see that she's not being skipped, we feel like we have to do our part to make sure that we evidence that it was the right choice to not skip over her, because she can win the election. So I think both of those are at play. I also think, though, that for the sort of clever Politico, there is an argument to make, and it'll be tough, but you're already going to have a tough race. There is an argument to make that your 2020 Kamala Harris, who's trying to play the progressive, she just never found her footing. She never found her voice. Doing this campaign where she can be the cop, going after the bad guy criminal, I think that she will be much more comfortable. I think that she will find her voice and her footing. And I think some people who are looking at the race that is going to be hard for Democrats do look at Kamala Harris and say, this prosecutor might be our best shot to actually go beat Donald Trump. So I think there are a lot of dynamics at play, and all of it is working together, to create a lot of energy.
Yeah, it's creating a lot of energy. So, go ahead, Kathryn.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. I think as someone who has like a very similar biography, one thing I would want to push back on, especially amongst I think the professional class, is oftentimes when you see Black people in these kinds of spaces, they're overqualified, particularly Black women as the most educated group. And so I think even just the idea of the identity politics, or, the sort of, I think being careful about the DEI hire kinds of things of that, I think qualification wise, as someone who came up from state politics, was a senator, is probably, even aside from her race and gender, has the standard sort of, except for she didn't go to an Ivy League law school, and she went to an HBCU. She has a very standard presidential candidate biography. Particularly for women, you have to be elected to some sort of statewide office. I do think it's interesting that she was a senator. Rather than something like an executive, like a governor. But I do think to be careful. And then I think also too, when you use that term identity politics, right? It's not just people of color that might be tempted to lean into that. I think also too, I can see people can make an argument that someone like JD Vance, because he's white, man from Ohio. It's like was chosen for his identity. So I definitely think that I do think that there's a lot of excitement because amongst the Black professional class, particularly Black women, because they can see themselves in her. But I want to be careful to say that I don't think it's just that they can see themselves in her. And we can get into this a little bit later, but
yeah, my major point was it wasn't completely policy, right? And if you see it, I mean, you'll see some people saying, "Hey, this is a Black person, let's vote for them on that basis." Now, my perspective on identity politics is this: I think identity politics is a product of racism, right? And so racism creates a situation where somebody's identity matters, and Black people are just reacting to that. However, when we're talking about the presidency and we're talking about people who are suffering and we need policies that really help people, whether it comes to housing and all that, I do think that, number one, on paper, I don't know that there's anybody more qualified. I think more qualified than Obama, certainly more qualified than Trump. But it's not just about paper, right? It's about what policies you stand by, what you stand for. And my point was this: you don't really see a whole lot of that talk. You do see more of leaning on, where she's coming from a racial standpoint. And absolutely, it happens on the right too. But I would want to point out, I just don't see a real serious critique at this point in that regard. And that's kind of where I'm coming from on that. And I do think there's things to criticize. And so when I don't see a critique and I just say, hey, she one of us, vote for her, I push back on that a little bit because that can get you in a lot of trouble, right? If you're not treating politics like politics and saying, okay, if I'm a pastor and I'm supporting Kamala Harris, well, what position does she take when it comes to people who are pro-life and pro-Christian sexual ethic who are trying to be the judge? Well, we've seen in judicial hearings where she hasn't been so kind to that. And so that's what I mean. Like, the primary consideration was that, have Black women gotten passed up? Absolutely. Should they? No. But it's more than just, to me, it's more than just an on paper, it's never anybody's turn when it comes to president, right? There are a lot of CEOs of major companies that I would skip over to be the president because it takes other things. So just to clarify, I'm glad you said that, because I'm sure there's people who were thinking, hey, hold up. But I do use that term because I think it's helpful, but it does deserve to be clarified. So let's get back to this. So you got Kamala Harris, who I haven't been a big fan of, certainly not a fan of Trump, but I think there needs to be a little more of a critique when we look at what's going on here. I want you guys to talk to me about some of the things that are going to come up in this race. In my opinion, my guy does have a racism and sexism problem, a major racism and sexism problem. So with Kamala being the candidate, that's going to come out full force. Absolutely. That's one that's one reality that we have to deal with. The other reality, I think, is that there's some people who would almost try to say this particular candidate has no flaws and try to cover it up with that too. Right. So how do we anticipate that? And then what I want you to do, some of the stuff that they're going to come at her with this misogyny and all that is going to have to do with sexual history and things of that nature. I'm not particularly interested in that, but I want to see if you guys can formulate for me a standard for how to address past sexual encounters, because it's happened with Clinton. It's, a lot of that, it's come up before. It has something in some instances to do with character. What's a standard that we can apply to both Trump and Kamala and Harris on that? And is it one standard or is there a double standard? And I think sometimes there is a double standard and sometimes that's okay. But if you could kind of give me a standard, Kathryn, I'd appreciate that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it's always fair to critique policy. I think even for people the reality of being human is you're going to disagree with just having two people in a room coming from different experiences, you're going to have disagreements. And so I think part of it is, I think one thing I would say is sort of maintaining the distance so that you can make those critiques. in terms of pushing things better, right? Like as politics as a vehicle for many things, voting as a vehicle for many things, and that this is not this one thing. And so I think, to your point, to the extent that you cover up or try to hush legitimate critiques on policy issues like housing, you're actually doing like a disservice. And I would argue like that's not consistent with the ethos of either Christianity or democracy. I would say in terms of, so I think policy critiques always, I think, are fair game. And I think related to that, I think when it comes to past sexual history, for me, the distinction I would make is things that are related to how they will govern. I think, or that you can see showing up in the ways in which they govern. I mean, I think that you can, I mean, I think with Kamala, like, you know, we know she's, you know, dated these different men, like it's kind of out there in the ethos. She's been a public figure for such a long time. But I would say, to the extent that it's a question not of her sort of personal sexual history, but in terms of who she is as a policymaker, that's a conversation I think that you're maybe on safer grounds. And to the extent that you're not willing to make that argument that there's something related to like the public and you're just talking about this and you're maybe like, you know, for lack of a better word, you know, slut shaming or calling her Jezebel or like those kinds of things because she is an attractive Black woman, like that is when I think you steer into the sort of misogynoir of it. But I think to the extent that, yeah, because I do think there is, and I would say even for Clinton, like I'll use him as an example. So for people, you know, I think the whole thing with Monica Lewinsky is that he then lied under oath. So then it's like you both, one, stepped out of your marriage, which is a character issue, but I think also two, lying to the American people, then how does that affect how I, as a voter or a citizen of this country in which you are the leader, trust anything that you say? And so I think then that's a different conversation than, well, back in the day, she might have dated singer Montel Williams, you know? So it's like, you know, I mean, that to me is a different conversation. So that's how in my mind, I'm thinking about it differently.
Got you. Thank you for that, Chris.
So I'll probably say, because I think that in the realm of like sexual history and where that comes in, I think to the extent that a public figure makes their own sexual history part of their public life or their sexual life part of their public life, it becomes fair game. So if you're abusing your formal power, you know, for sexual purposes, that is fair game to talk about. If you are celebrating in public your own sexual conquest, that is fair game. I don't think that like a person's, especially their sexual history, is necessarily, you know, really fair game to talk about in the context of a campaign. Primarily, like Kathryn was saying, what is the real connection to how they're going to govern? What is the real connection to their leadership capacity? Just because somebody had a lot of, you know, relationships before they settled into the relationship that they are in now, what does that really have to do with the course of how they're going to govern? So I lay it out this way because it may seem like over the course of this campaign, if somebody's listening to Pastor Chris Butler, it may seem like something of a double standard. But I think that if you're talking about, I'll be explicit, Donald Trump's sexual history, where the conversation is more around, you know, abuse of formal power, public celebration of conquest. These are things that he brought into the conversation versus trying to bring things that Vice President Harris has explicitly tried to keep out of the conversation, and other people are dragging them into the conversation. I think that one is much more fair game in public discourse than the other.
Yeah, and I don't think it's particularly relevant. But I'm trying to anticipate what somebody who may be more conservative might say, right? If we're talking about character, and you're also talking about qualifications. If someone said, "Well, there was a very public political relationship that helped get you to where you are," do you think that's off limits?
So I don't know to the extent that one that can be proven, right? Because sometimes, and I'll go back to like my Chicago Democratic Party roots, right? Like there is no place in the world that can, that has more kind of like nepotism and like the political relationship and that type of things. But I think you got to be really careful to say that you had this romantic relationship and therefore that is why you got this political advancement. The two things can be true, but not necessarily causative, right? People date. That is a reality of like human interaction. Kamala Harris is an attorney who was involved in politics. Seemed to me like a pretty good prosecutor. To get to the place where she was. So I think that it is. I think you're on very treacherous ground when you go and say, well, this dating relationship is the reason why you got this position or the reason why you got elected to the next position, because the two things are not necessarily causative.
And I
Okay.
will say, I think I agree with that with Pastor Chris, but I also think, you know, success. I think the thing that Americans have such a hard time with is because we're such an individualistic character. And so we want to bring it down to like this one thing this one person did to get where they are. And the reality is that is not the case. I think for most of us, regardless of your race, sex, gender, class, a lot of where I am in my life is a product of the fact that my parents were middle class and college educated. Like, and so then to say, well, because she was born to Eddie and Zelda Freeman, the only reason she's an attorney and a theologian is because she was their daughter. Well, I'm not going to, that is a factor, but it's not the only reason. I had to do my own work. I had to work hard. And if I wasn't qualified, to pass the bar or, get into a PhD program, then like I wouldn't progress. I mean, I think that's also too a part of it. So to say that, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that could have been a factor or it's a part of. I think where the sexism comes in is to say then that that's the only reason. And I think on the flip side, right, like I'll use some of the women in the Trump family as an example. Like Laura Trump is now the vice chair of the RNC. A big part of that is because she shares the last name of the, but that's not to say, I mean, I don't know. I didn't watch a lot of the RNC, and so I can't really speak to like how good she is or not at her job. But I would say then I would have a problem with people saying like Ivanka Trump only had her position because she's Donald Trump's daughter, like, and because she was married to Jared Kushner's wife. Like that is diminishing across the board, even for conservative women that have benefited from marriage relationships, familial relationships. And I just think that part of it is like like you want to be like, I'm the sole controller of where I am in life. And I think just even for Christians, like that's not true. Like we know like there are all these things like working in our favor that are outside of our control and things that we have not done that put us in the position. And so then to say, well, you're only a pastor because your grandmother prayed for you. I mean, no one would, you know what I mean? Like no one would do that. And so I think that's the concern about the sexism. I think you can see her political relationship early on in her career as a factor. But I think where the problem comes and the sexism comes is to say that the only reason she is where she is because of this relationship she had 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think number one, let me say this again. I don't think that subject is particularly probative. I don't think it's helping us get to who will actually be the best president. So I agree there. I've talked about my past, and so I hope people wouldn't say, well, you can't be a preacher because in the past you did this or that. So I can't really condemn her for any of that stuff because I get it. But I'll say this, and so I agree with you guys' the standard that you laid out. I think that's a solid standard. I think that gets us to a more constructive place. I'm not exactly sure if we apply that equally. I'm not exactly sure that's been applied equally to all presidential candidates, right? I'm not sure if it's been applied in that way, or that some of the people complaining now were complaining when it was somebody that they didn't like. So that's the only difference that I would point out. So let's get to it. Let's talk about, starting with Kathryn, let's talk about some of her strengths and weaknesses, and you can just do both together.
Yeah, I think a weakness is the fact that she is from California. I do think that that's a weakness. They tend to be very liberal, and I don't know that, especially if we're talking about an election that's going to be won around the margins in places like Michigan and Georgia, that is a particularly helpful part of her biography. I think that she needs to find a more maybe unifying message on reproductive freedom and justice in a way that can makes the tent big enough for women that for whom sort of abortion on demand is prohibitive. I would say, yeah, I think those are sort of the main things that I think consistently that I've seen. I think also too, I think one thing that got her, I think in 2019, and that it felt like she was a Rorschach test. Like, it wasn't really clear what she was for, what she was against, what she did, what she didn't do. And so I remember in 2019, and this has actually come up again in some group chats, of like how genuine she is. I do think, based on what I have seen so far yesterday and today, she's much better at giving stump speeches than she was in 2019. But I think some of that kind of, and I think I would say a similar thing about former President Obama, that there was a little bit of people projecting that he did a good job of allowing people to project whatever they wanted on to him and see in him whatever they, like they found comfort or joy in. But I would say, I think we're just in a different place in our country than we were in 2008 and 2012. And I think, to me, that remains a concern of like, well, who are you? Like, getting down to like who you are really. I do think, to something that Pastor Chris said earlier, the idea of like her really leaning into that she is a cop is, I think, helping her a lot, because I think, in 2019 it was like, who are you? I think the cop thing, and like it seems like that's going to be a central part of her message. Is it a place of improvement?
That's good. Yeah, I'm gonna start where you didn't leave off, but it was close to the end. As far as failure, as far as weaknesses, I think she comes off as not as genuine, right? I don't think she's a particularly talented politician because of that. Because some people, even Joe Biden, like that was his thing. You could relate to him. He seemed genuine. People liked him, right? I don't think she necessarily has that. And so I'll give you an example. Even when she goes on the Breakfast Club and she's like, hey, I used to smoke weed while listening to Snoop Dogg and Tupac. Well, when I was in college, Snoop Dogg and Tupac weren't even out when you were in college. You know what I'm saying? So it's like you're trying to relate, but it comes off as, come on, man. First of all, black people aren't going to vote for you just because you smoke weed. You know what I'm saying? And then number two, you got the dates wrong and it just looked bad. I'm with you as well, Kathryn. I think the abortion issue, I don't know that she's ever proposed I don't know if she has any limits about it whatsoever. And for that to be something that she's leading with is tough. Now, I want to, because I just recently heard this argument, I want to address it. One of the arguments that people say is like, basically that's a white evangelical issue, and that white evangelicals didn't really start even talking about it till like the 70s or 80s. That may be true. I don't know when they started talking about it. I wouldn't be surprised. The question for me on abortion, is it right or wrong? And her stance to me seems wrong, right? And so that's something that we kind of have to work through and think about too. Lastly, I would say one of the weaknesses, again, I talked about what happened in California with housing and all that stuff. When she was on the Judiciary Committee and basically almost showed me a religious test, right, for judicial candidates, where if you're not in the right place on abortion, or you're not in the right place when it comes to marriage, that you can't be here, then you can't be a judge, is hugely problematic to me. So very quickly, and I know, Kathryn, you're on a time limit, so if you have to go, that's cool. We'll bring you back on for sure. But let me just very quickly touch on some of the things that I think she does well. I think that, when she's practiced and she's ready to go, she can deliver a message. And we saw that, what was she in Wisconsin the other day? She did a very good job with that. her record, like I said, on paper, she has one of the best resumes that there is. And I don't say that it's just a paper. I mean, she had to do all that stuff. She had to get elected. She had to go through those processes. She's been there for a reason. And I think those are two of her biggest strengths going into this. What you got? Go ahead.
Oh,
Kathryn.
can I just say one more thing about what she did well? Sorry, I missed that part. I want to also give her credit for the amount of attention and focus she's put on the issue of maternal mortality, especially among Black women. I mean, I think that's the conversation around, where I think that maybe there's wiggle room doesn't feel like the right word, but I think that all of those things have been kind of collapsed. But I think as someone who is definitely concerned about Black women who want to have families dying in childbirth, that some of these sort of restrictions don't account for the life-altering medical situations that can arise with that. I do think that to me is a huge benefit on her side as someone who can talk to and has seemed to make that a big part of her policy portfolio as vice president. I look forward to hearing more about how she plans to address that issue as a president, as a presidential candidate. But I definitely think the sort of focus on Black women's health and ability to bear children and be mothers and watch their children grow up into adulthood is something I want more politicians on both sides to be talking about.
That's good. Thank you for that. What you got, Chris?
Yeah, I think on the weakness side, obviously, coming out of California is something huge. I do think abortion is a potential weakness because, some people say that's a white evangelical issue. I would say tell that to the Church of God in Christ. Tell that to my grandmother, my auntie Irene. It's not. And politically, it's an issue of extremes. And I think the Republican Party has experienced a few years of being viewed as the extremist on this. And I think Democrats make a mistake to reach so far that they reclaim that position, because I think that's the place that makes it hard politically, is when you are viewed as the extremist. On the positive side, I don't know that there's a ton that can be said about where she's going to govern from a policy perspective, because as has already been discussed here, that's very difficult to tease out based on what she's said and done in public life. I do think that elections are about moments, and I think that Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, is about to be up against a historically bad candidate that was not so obvious when you were putting up your own historically bad candidate. But she's going to face somebody who will not be able to prosecute this case about clarity around policy issues, who is convicted of felonies, who is generally looked at as a bad guy, and she gets to play the cop. And in that moment, I think that it is a moment that she will be able to thrive as a candidate for public office. How she's going to govern is, for me, that's very hard to tease out. But I think that this is an election where she's got a shot.
Oh yeah, can she win? I think definitely she can win. I mean, this is one of the worst candidates that that you see in an election. His favorability is super low. Not that hers is really high, but it's something that can be done. And somebody who just she's running against Trump, who just has no discipline. And here's the other thing I think is going to happen when we talk about misogyny and talk about racism. I don't know that the right has the self-control not to have what they say backfire on them, which it should if they go that far. And it's looking like it will. The DEI
that is the forbidden fruit for the Republican Party. I think if they can run an election campaign where they don't reach for that, they can probably win. I just don't think that the candidate and many people in the base have the discipline to do so.
Again, MAGA does have a racism and sexism problem. The DEI candidate and all that stuff. I don't know who they think they're attracting by that, or they're just filled with that kind of stuff and they can't filter it out, right? I think it's really gonna hurt Trump at the end of the day, and we'll kind of see what happens. I don't think Kathryn's gonna be with us in the next part of this episode. So, Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us. We got to have you back so we can finish this. Any last words?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing, so I won't be in the next segment, is just like a word of caution that I'm hearing, particularly among Black Christians, the sort of adopting of the Esther for such a time as this language. If we are going to have a conversation about Christian nationalism, it cannot we cannot have a definition of Christian nationalism that is just about us condemning white conservative evangelicals. Like, we have to talk about all of it. And I think there's nothing wrong with supporting her and feeling like that's who you see as the best opportunity for, supporting the sort of visions you have for yourself and your neighbors. But I just want a word of caution about adopting that language. I have seen that, and I get it. I do. But I think if we want to have clear conversations around the dangers of Christian nationalism, we have to watch that, because America is not the kingdom of Israel. There's just no parallels, and so I think we're in a very dangerous place, and it makes it harder for us to make the argument when we see Christian nationalism maybe that we don't agree with on the other side, if we are adopting similar language talking about the soul of America and X, Y, and Z. That I think is elevating the state, the nation state, democracy to a place for Christians it does not belong. Not to say that there's not a place for Christians in democracy, but I think we definitely don't want to elevate America to that sort of idolatrous position where we feel like we're in some sort of cosmic battle for a soul of something for a kingdom that will fade away.
Yeah.
So those are my final words.
So good.
And that, my friend, is impartiality, right? That's applying the same standard to both sides. And I'll just say this. I think one of the main things Christians are going to have to do, if you're on the right, you're going to need to temper. You're going to need to push back on some of this racism and sexism that's going to be coming at you full speed. If you're on the left, especially like us African Americans, be honest about your candidate's flaws and don't use those things as a shield for your candidate's flaws. Your candidate has flaws. The other candidate has flaws too. But we got to do our best to do what Kathryn just did and make sure we're impartial. We'll be right back on the Church Politics Podcast.
Your eyes on the times, you walk ready to speak up. But with so many problems, you're exhausted trying to keep up.
This is the Church Politics Podcast, where you can get political commentary from a biblical worldview. We're not trying to be conservative or progressive. We're trying to be Christian in the public square.
And I'm black as heaven. I'm made in God's image. Nobody can change my settings. Hey man, got off my knees and put an end to my search. It's easy to sell your soul when you don't know what it's worth.
And we are back on the Church Politics Podcast. And I hope listening to those two first segments, you understand why we had Kathryn Freeman on here. Brought a great perspective, brought some pushback, brought just some good conversation about the dynamics that are going on here. Let me say this again, and I said this on my last Civic Update. We are obviously in a very polarized political environment right now. It was polarized when you had Biden versus Trump, two older white men. It's about to be extra polarizing when you have a white man and a black woman. This could, I don't know, Chris, this could be one of the ugliest elections that we've seen based on that. Not that it was going to be pretty before, but those dynamics make it ugly. Christians are really going to have to step into this with some sobriety and with wisdom. We really have to make sure that we are, even in our advocacy, I'm not saying that you can't advocate for a particular candidate, but we have to do it with one thing in mind almost first, that win, lose, or draw, people are going to have hope and coexist after this is over. If your messaging either makes people hopeless if they lose or makes them want to attack the other side, win or loss, after this is over, as a Christian, especially as a Christian leader, you failed. What that means to me, especially for Christian leaders, is as you go into campaign mode, and we can debate whether a Christian leader should be in campaign mode, but do what you got to do. Understand that there's a conflict to some extent in you being a shepherd and you being like the most effective campaign surrogate. The campaign surrogate doesn't have the same standard of honesty, doesn't have the same standard of impartiality. Please keep that in mind. And what that means in practice to me, Chris, is You cannot share every meme that you get from the campaign. You cannot use every talking point that you get from the campaign. If you're going to engage in that way, make sure you do so with a standard and that you're willing to reject some of the things that they send to you, even if you like the candidate. And if you can't do that, I think you need to think deeply about why you can't do that and you're refusing to do that. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about the role of Christians in this election and the role of the church in this election, a few things come to mind. Number one is making sure that we understand the distinction there. I don't think that there is a, like you use the phrase, a good phrase, campaign mode. The church does not have a campaign mode, right? Like the church does not really have a stake in this electoral campaign, even in this government and this country, right? Like we are just involved in something so much higher and so much more long lasting. It is eternal, the things that we are engaged in. And there's a certain extent to which the unity of the church cannot be ever perceived as a political unity, right? It's a unity that is around the cross, not a political orientation, and therefore it assumes in the United States a political diversity. And so you've got to understand that. And then I think people should be thinking on an individual level, think really hard about what is your role, right, in the church and in various other institutions. Certainly, there are going to be Christians who are involved in campaigns, who are involved in issue advocacy groups, and that's going to be one particular type of engagement. Those of us who are like shepherding congregations and have regular pulpit presence, we should be as judicious about what we say and how we say it as we are about most other things, right? Like we wouldn't, we will share. I think a lot of pastors share about how they're processing things and working through stuff and what's happening, in their own personal lives. But to add the authority of the pulpit and the scripture to something that is political is just a massive, massive mistake. And I pray that we're very careful about that. And then the last thing that I'll say is that all that being said, we will do ourselves a huge favor if we don't try to act like we know how to do this. And that's on any side of this. There has never been a Black woman running for president of the United States as a major party nominee, right? We have Black women who ran for president, but as a major party nominee, we haven't done this before. And so this might hit our emotions, because I can share this with the podcast, and this is family. I've never been a fan of Vice President Kamala Harris. If anything, I've been a big critic of a lot of her politics and policy as she has been on the national stage. But there was a little bit of excitement to see her standing there given a speech as a presumptive nominee for a major political party, just because she is an African American woman. She belongs to the same sorority as my mother-in-law, right? Like there's a connectivity there that might hit you in a way that you're not expecting. And on the other side, there might be a temptation to lean into racism, sexism, misogyny in ways that you don't even anticipate from yourself. And I think that a huge part of heading off some of that is to take a step back and understand that we have not been this way before. None of us have done this before. And so we've got to be extra careful in every single thing that we do, because we're doing something that is new to all of us.
Yeah, guys, we really have to focus in and make sure that we're doing this better than we've done in the past, because I don't think we've done a good job of representing who we're supposed to represent. So, hey, if you're excited about this, keep that excitement. There's nothing wrong with being excited about your candidate and pushing them forward. But also, let me say this, especially for preachers: respect the pulpit and respect the law. Mm-hmm. If you know there's certain things you're not supposed to say because of your status, your tax status, then don't say it. Don't sneak it in. And here's why I say that. Because we talk so bad about other people when they break the rules. But then is it okay for us to break the rules when we think the stakes are high, or just because we feel like doing it and we have a platform to do it? I see that happen a lot where people are really bending the rules when it comes to that. Are you okay when other people bend the rules that you don't like, that aren't supporting the same candidate as you? Think about that. Any last words, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate the second half of that: respect the pulpit, right? Like, even beyond your tax status, like we have a sacred duty when we stand in that pulpit. And remember how you feel. You know, if you're excited about Kamala Harris enough to like get out there and support her, which is, I guess, any preacher's prerogative. Remember how you felt when you saw, some preacher standing in their pulpit, praying over Donald Trump and, saying that he was, anointed by God to come and win the election, all that stuff. Remember how that made you feel. And then ask yourself the question if you're doing the same thing. Because my granny's come up in this episode already, so I'll refer to her one final time. Two wrongs, my granny would tell us, don't make right. And so we just have to consider that.
Yeah, if that wasn't biblical when they did it for Trump, even if you think that your candidate is better, it doesn't make it biblical just because they're better, right? Be careful how you use the pulpit. And again, respect the law. The former being more important, obviously. Well, that's it. I think this was a great episode, Chris. We got to have Kathryn on. I think she has some great points, always very thoughtful, but also provides some pushback. And I think sometimes we need a woman's perspective on this show sometimes. So I'm glad that she joined us, and she will be back on. That's a promise. And it won't take 4 years. All right. All right, Ann Camp. There's a cross that neither political conservatism nor progressivism is fit to bear. There's a civic hearing in need of faithful witnesses who love social justice and won't surrender the truth to be loved by the world. Politic with the truth and compassion of Jesus Christ. Until next time, Ann Camp. We'll holla at you.
Dear Lord.